Hello and welcome to the Jazz History Database. Today is November 15, 2017. My name is Professor Rich Falco. I'm Director of Jazz Studies at WPI, Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Worcester, Mass., and founder and director of the Jazz History Database. Today's guest has been heavily steeped in jazz and creative music in many ways and for many years, but don't let his laid-back demeanor fool you. The man's a human dynamo, actually, and relative to the jazz world has been engaged in many different ways. He seems to have fully embraced what Ram Blake called the primacy of the ear, focus on sound, in other words. From 1993 to 2001, he was the research manager at Verve Records and oversaw the remastering of jazz reissues and established and managed the reissue staff at that time. Former director of broadcasting and operations at WKCR FM radio at Columbia University in New York City from 1992 to 2014. And his duties included archiving and preservation, sound restoration, and field recordings. So a broad array of audio captures there. Began the archive project at KCR in 2011, and we'll probably talk a bit about that as well. He's also the author of Dixonia, which is a biodiscography of Bill Dixon. And he has Triple Point Records and Triple Point Music, which is a boutique label, vinyl and CDs, which works with other independent labels and artists to help distribute and promote their music. And now serves on the faculty of jazz at Lincoln Center's Swing University, where he teaches Jazz 101 educational program. I'm really excited to have him here today. I've been wanting to get him in the seat for some time. Please welcome our guest today, Ben Young.
Thank you, Rich. Exciting for me to be here with you cats.
Well, thank you. Let's get started with how you were first introduced to creative music and jazz, more specifically.
Yeah, I guess I'm still trying to piece that together myself. Like a lot of people, I had a little germ of a memory from when I was a small kid. You guys might recognize this name, actually. This is the strangest answer you've ever gotten to that question. There's a Republican senator from Tennessee, which is where I grew up, who was at that time running for governor, named Lamar Alexander, and he was a Dixieland trumpet player. And when he was stumping for his 1978 campaign, my parents took me out to see him when I was, 6 years old, to see this guy playing trumpet as a way of sort of reaching to the people. And it shows you something about how the times have changed a little bit. But that's one of the first memories I have of seeing music being played by somebody where I said, what is going on? I was going to join the school band playing drums from 5th grade into high school, and so in that process got to know the names and reputations of a lot of people who I wanted to follow up. Louis Armstrong, Miles Davis would be the key folks. I was not a trumpet player, but I had a little trumpet player envy, I think. And so as a kid, when I was a teenager, I sort of just made my way to some of the recordings of Armstrong's Hot Five, and believe it or not, the Miles Davis Bitches Brew on the same day as his Blue Note records, and sort of said, okay, let me start here and figure out what's going on.
Wow.
So that was my high school experience, was getting used to the sounds of mainstream jazz by way of Miles Davis's groups, and eventually through the rock and roll I was listening to, I would actually say got toward creative music, so capital C, capital M, even though it wasn't really about improvisation or jazz. But one thing led to another, and the pop music I was listening to led to an art dimension of rock, which led to a sort of experimental dimension of what rock-derived sound was like, and what we call industrial music was a thing for me in the 80s. And then one thing leads to another. You guys know this whole story. You see a name dropped, and I actually followed up some guys who played at Soundscape, who were still active musicians, who had a little extreme noise band of saxophones called Borbedo Magus, and bought some of their records, and they said literally, when we were kids, we used to listen to every Eric Dolphy record and every Albert Ayler record as they came out. I said, who are those guys? And so that led me to know these are names to follow up, this is music to chase down, and that was the finish of my high school and pushing me off into college, where I wanted to go to a place where I was in it enough that I wanted to go to a place where they knew who those people were and cared about them. And that was going to Columbia, and the radio station there, WKCR, was probably the leading broadcast institution to care about the avant-garde end of creative improvised music.
Yes, so let's start with that as well. So now you find yourself in New York at Columbia. As an undergrad, you were studying African American history and culture and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah. And was that a direct link to the music for you, or how did that work? Yeah.
Well, I realized a year into school that I wanted to, I might as well study officially the thing I was studying unofficially through radio and elsewhere. And that meant the music of Eiler and Cecil Taylor and Coltrane, and it meant the writing of Leroy Jones and Mary Baraka and so on. So I said, okay, where are the courses where I can actually do this? And if you gathered those all together and glued them into one big mass, you could assemble a major under the African American Studies heading. Yeah. So that was, and it's funny for me in retrospect to say I was actually, as soon as I got out of college, I was actually working in my field, and people would laugh at that and say, yeah, you kind of are. Instead of taking a day job, you're actually doing, whatever the hard scrabble work of jazz is. That was what I trained to do. Yeah. Through official studies in class, and very much through unofficial, the whole process of how do you present this music on radio, which led to how do you present it in a classroom and how do you present it in print to try to use the knowledge to enhance people's understanding.
Well, and the reason why I'm asking about all of this early time for you is because the radio station had been established for a number of years prior to your arrival. And what was the formatting at that time? Were they playing, did they have a jazz-specific format, or were they small programmings that were allotted to different styles of music?
Both. It was predominantly jazz, we would say, or the plurality of it was. And I should say, as a topic sentence, WKCR formed me a lot more than I formed WKCR. Mm-hmm. So it was there because of the people I studied with. It was there in place and already up and running and going gangbusters through my entire lifetime up to that period. So in the top of the 70s, it had changed format to say, jazz is where it's at, let's do this, and let's embrace the whole tradition, right? Let's pay close attention to the ancient masters whose works we can still hear, and some of whom are still here to comment on it, and also close attention to the music that's happening in the loft scene downtown, and try to give a boost to the independent, activities that are happening there. So that was, and I kind of got to the party after it wasn't over, but it had been up and running for some time. Yeah. In that regard, I actually joined the station with the intent to do what they called new music. So I was very intent on Yanis Xenakis and a bunch of American and European composers. Some of that weird stuff, as people have it accused of. And then within a couple of years realized that it would be easy enough to marry the jazz consciousness of modern improvised music to what I was paying attention to in composed music also, and trace both of those back upstream. This was part of the program, that if you're going to drop down, you guys probably have some of the same experience, if you're going to drop down in jazz, you start with what you know, but it's the job of the faculty to say, here's what stands behind what you know, or here's some other stuff that you will like, you just haven't heard of it yet, or here's some stuff that you've probably told yourself is square and uninteresting, but look again at Sidney Bechet and you'll find something that's actually worth listening to there. So that process just completely took over where I was at. And thankfully I was young enough still to be able to imprint all those things. And many of you probably are in this spot right there, where you're eating up jazz hand over fist. Give me the sounds, give me the information, and load it into your mind and have that as the sort of internal database of what's going on. Yeah. So that was my college experience.
Now, there was no media major at Columbia at the time, is that right?
Correct, yeah. It was far beneath the Ivy League to do such a thing, so which is ironic because the entire radio spectrum there was a recreation, right? That was a co-curricular, as we would call it. Involvement for people that you never got credit for. A few people got paid for it, but basically it was kind of like a religion, really, if you don't mind my saying that, or like a secret society that people. It was like a fraternity or a sorority, really. Mm-hmm. You want to spend all your time in the clubhouse. You want to party with those people. You want to get into what they're doing. you want to maybe run for office and help to guide the thing and so on like that.
Yeah.
So that was I'm sure still is the sort of spirit that guides that place.
Yeah, and it's very rare, of course, for FM stations to be detached from a university. Most of them started that way, essentially. And I can think of, well, now there are two here in central Massachusetts that both started, in fact, one right here in this very building, WICN Radio, but have eventually detached and become autonomous. But I think it was very common for that to be the case, yet they were always sort of the bastard child of the university, you know. As you said, sort of a club of sorts. And here, I think at WPI, we now have a radio club. And we broadcast just with within the school itself.
It's I mean, I'll say one summary thing on that, which is this guy Bill Dixon, who you mentioned, who I spent a lot of time studying, he used to have a great phrase, several of them that are just kind of like the mottos of my whole existence, but one of them was, if you don't sit around waiting to get called to go to Carnegie Hall, this is your Carnegie Hall. Wherever you're at, you need to give it like as though it's the most important thing you'll ever do. And that's, I mean, to me, that's the thing that helped WKCR how do you say it, to have the self-respect, even if this isn't for credit, even if nobody's getting a doctorate for the work they do here, why would you not do doctoral level work? Why are you waiting around for somebody to incentivize something? There's a passion that drives it instead of that sort of incentive. And I would wish for all the radio clubs, you know, and all the stations that are or aren't still affiliated, the mission is, let's activate people to care about this music by showing them what it sounds like, and here's what to listen to. Whether you're getting paid for it, whether you're getting credit for it, whether you're getting glory for it, there's another Bill Dixon phrase, you might be anonymous, you don't have to be mediocre.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, that's his whole world.
That's it, man. So how did you move from being an undergraduate student involved in the station to actually running the station?
Well, that's a long process. I was an undergrad, and like a lot of people in some of the stations we're talking about that aren't KCR, many college radio stations have this experience. Folks graduate and still want to stay involved because that's where the action is. And I did exactly that and was part of the core of alumnus programmers. So for the next 10 years or so, I was working in the music business and doing regular shows at KCR as kind of a recreational involvement, trying to teach young people where possible, and you'd hope that those people, the older and more experienced they get, will do handsome programming that's not quite so fledgling as what beginners in radio will do. I'd like to think that was true for me. So that was about 10 years or so, and then finally one thing led to another in the top of the 2000s, where it was administratively sensible for KCR to say, we need to create a position for a new director. And that was actually, so the second half of my time there was in this official capacity, not faculty, but an admin, as it's a director position, was full-time overseeing, training, troubleshooting, all sorts of stuff like that. And that was a slow process. I knew the station inside out from having been there as an alum, so they went out on a limb and hired me, even though I didn't have a student affairs background or higher education background. What I did have was music background and intense interior knowledge of what was going on in that place.
Yeah. And so you were actually engaged in training students to do on-air programming or behind-the-scenes work, or all of the above?
All of it, yeah. Like that, all of the things. I don't know if you guys have seen some of the video footage, but that archive project in 2011. To be honest, that wasn't anything new. That had been going on a sort of guerrilla basis, if you will, or unofficial basis, through people like me, people I trained, other people who came up after me would say, here is this great treasury of sound. The only way we're going to be able to access this body of music that's not on records is to learn to use the technology that will play these things back. So there was a constant process, and I'd like to think, I'm not affiliated with the station anymore, but I'd like to think there still is a process of training people in backwards technological understanding, to say, you guys need to know everything there is about 78 transfer, you guys need to know everything there is about tape transfer, right? And also curating and restoration of these things, because these are some of the ones that are arrayed here. These are the hard artifacts that we go to get these sounds. And if you're going to, A, if you're going to get the sounds, you often need to go there, and B, if you're going to work as an insider in this field or speak with understanding, it will behoove you to know how these things run. How does it spin? How does it convey sound, and so on like that. But yeah, that was very much the training that I did, was trying to style and content and the broadest understandings of how should we make sense in radio, of how do we present this. And a part of it, it was a multi-layer thing. You guys probably understand this, that like these cats were on radio, 18, 19, 20 years old, preaching about something that they themselves were learning about.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of synchronizing all these understandings. Here's how, you need to first be an expert in this, and then you're going to go forth real soon and start talking about it in terms that you know, and don't talk above the level of understanding that you have, but hopefully you're still, you know, increasing that level of understanding at all times. So those are some of the many levels of training that were going on there. And since it was a public radio station, teaching people how to beg for money on the radio, which is something that will never go away, it seems like, and teaching people how to be the leadership core that was running the station. Those are sort of the Roman numerals of that task.
Well, a couple more questions about the station, if you don't mind, because I'm very curious about lots of this. First, just a brief question about the show contents. Were they stylistically based by era, or were they just an array of sounds? Was there a show specific to big band or Dixieland, that kind of thing?
Great question. It ultimately was up to the programmer. And sometimes there were a few people there who carved out a niche for themselves to say in this frame of the week, these 3 hours, you can expect to hear this kind of music. There was one cat there. Actually, you guys know this guy. There's a guy who plays drums with Vampire Weekend. Fearless Chris Thompson used to be a pretty good guitar player. And before that, he was a very good radio person. But he did a show, 5 a.m. on Monday mornings, where he was like, as far as I'm concerned, the whole crucible of jazz going into fusion is May of 1968. So I'm going to play every known recording from May of 1968. And for the 2 semesters or whatever, staked out this turf for himself to say, this is what's going on. So sometimes as specific as that, but we're stirring the pot, Rich, where we want these guys to be thinking all over. So in a certain way, the program, well, how should you say it? At its best, the programming would follow the curiosity of the students.
Yeah.
And maybe they want to say, I'm going to preach to you today using examples from the text of 1927, 1949, and 1963. The principle is the same, the players will be different, or something like that.
Yeah. That's wonderful, yeah. The reason why I'm asking is because from a layman's perspective, it appears that radio stations are becoming a little bit more niche marketed, so to speak. And it has something to do in the jazz field, at least from where I sit, relative to funding. So if you have the big band String of Pearls radio show every Saturday afternoon, you certainly have a demographic of folks who are really involved in big band music and engaged and are willing to support you so that you can continue doing program like that. Is that the case that you've seen nationally, or is it more of just this particular region of the country?
It's a great question. I mean, and I have to say, I was never the kind of person who goes to the radio conferences to know what everybody else is doing. I was very insular, partly out of the conceit that WKCR was kind of already a thing apart, and we would say already leading the pack on how do we really make a difference.
Yeah.
And I guess the best answer I could give you on that, based on my experience there and elsewhere, is that for anybody, I think this is true all up and down the board, anybody trying to preach jazz now or trying to get the music into people's ears, will all fail if we try to get it to the audience that's already there.
Yeah.
The only success is if we say, you don't know about this music, I will tell you about it.
Yeah.
I will play it for you and I will tell you about it. Because let's face it, if you're talking about String of Pearls and Glenn Miller, if you want the Glenn Miller audience to be listening to your radio station, you're down to the 92-year-olds, man.
That's it, man.
And there's less than 92-year-olds, may they all be sitting listening to the radio and enjoying it, but they're not going to live to be 192, right? So if you can instead convince the 32-year-olds, here's a thing of value, you could be paying attention to this too. It's a greater number of people, they're likely more active, they're probably more able to be supportive and hook into that. They're also training their own kids and playing that around the house and all up and down the line. That's the way it's going to disseminate.
Yeah.
So I very much have that conviction that when I first started in radio, we were in that mode where you get people who would say, yes, I remember going up to dance at the Savoy, and I remember what that was like, and we're running low on those people to the point where I don't think it's shrewd at all to focus a dimension on that. Now, should there be a big band program? Absolutely. But it should make full explanation to you cats and say, here's, let's start at point one.
Yeah.
Topic sentence. The main idea is this. And here are some examples of that, and now we'll go forward.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. So, staying with that just for a moment, KCR is just such an important part of the city, and
for a small minority of people, yes.
Okay. But there was a very specific demographic, and one could argue that pretty sophisticated market, so to speak, for that music and for that station specifically. But as we started moving into streaming and moving the station into an international presence, did that in any way change what was going on at the station in terms of programming?
That's a great question. You'll hate my answer, which is no.
All right. That's fine. I mean, I would have preferred the no answer because you've made a stand. The station's made a stand, and they understand who they are, and they've got an identity. And if they want to share that with the world, wonderful. If there was no need to have to make shifts, why?
Well, and it's partly about, you can tell I'm speaking from a position of like self-righteousness or something relative to the music. Like, I know that this is the right thing. I'm a crusader on that path, right? Mm-hmm. There are other people at all levels of percentages of that kind of conviction at WKCR, at WICN, in this room, right, everywhere. Mm-hmm. But from the position of that conviction, if you're doing something that's right for some people, why would it not be right for all people? Meaning, if that last little paragraph where I was saying, you got to preach it so everybody can get it, everybody can understand. They can walk away and say, I hate this Glenn Miller stuff, but I understand it, right? That's a success in a way. But if you're doing it right, then it wouldn't need to be translated to go to audiences in France or in Madagascar or in Australia, right? It's just the same basic explanation is there.
Bravo. Well said, man. So I see, when I look over the arc of your career, it appears that you were really drawn to non-visual media, like recordings and radio and so forth, Today we have, of course, generations of two generations probably of young folks who are engaged in music in a very different way. That music videos and all of that new way of consuming this art form has seemed to have overtaken the generations two probably of young folks who are now the ones engaged in making the music as well as consuming. And I'm wondering how you get around that when you're doing the educational component. As you can see, I'm transitioning now into your career as an educator, but I am very curious about that. First, that you have always been engaged in non-visual through, radio obviously, but even in your teaching practice, we've discussed how you're not using visuals per se. So what's up with that?
Well, it's funny that you say transitioning, like that you're saying I'm transitioning into a different topic, and I would say, no, you're not. It's the same, and that's the whole point. It's the same topic. And I don't know, this wasn't my idea to say it'll be all about the non-visual stuff. It was more that, people, you guys know, people fall in love with record covers. You guys know the cover to Eric Dolphy's record, Out to Lunch, right? There's a lot of people in the world, and if you don't, go find out, right? There's a lot of people in the world who like that record and who will start by saying, oh, that cover. There's an iconography that we shouldn't throw away or shouldn't get rid of, but the cover is only so much. It's a great photo, it's a great layout, it's not the same as music, and it actually has nothing to do with Eric Dolphy. He didn't sit and pick it out. They picked it out for him and said, here's your record. So the place that I got on this train was back in 1989 or whatever, was saying the sounds are what's important, And that came from my background, knowing what the instruments were in the ensemble, right? In school band and in orchestra, actually wanting to pay attention to know what instruments make what sounds. And I'll get back to that in just a second. But so anyway, the radio thing was just a way of stepping into here's the bath of sounds where we can experience that kind of beauty. And I guess for me, we were poor enough that we didn't have MTV, so I wasn't, video didn't kill the radio star for me, and that was a useful thing. Many of my contemporaries had exactly the upbringing you're talking about, which is much more prevalent now. We're used to seeing the music and not just hearing the music. So maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's not. The major place where I'm sure that I'm disadvantaging the people that I teach through just a line of sounds or a line of talk is that not everybody understands what images go with the sound of the soprano saxophone or the sousaphone, right, or the bass drum. And that understanding really is fundamental, and that's one of the things I have to stipulate when doing any kind of jazz teaching is, if you don't know this would be the place to go, and this actually is where YouTube is going to be useful for you to click on and say soprano saxophone. Be able to hear the sound and know what it looks like. And many of you guys, many of your colleagues are studying music, so they are familiar with that just through osmosis. Some of us were lucky enough to come up in that background. But if the matter is teaching the rank and file who aren't from a jazz background, then that has to be part of the fundament of it. And to my discredit, I don't pay enough attention to that. It would be great. You mentioned one of the great ideas that has showed up here of having an instrument petting zoo related to some of these concerts to say, go up and push down the key. Here's kid, push down the key, push down the valve on this trumpet, or I'll blow into it and you push down and see what's going to happen to change it. I think that understanding is invaluable if we're going to actually know the mechanism of jazz delivery and jazz performance.
Yeah, and with the little ones, the petting zoo has always been a big success. Just seeing the size of a baritone sax,
But this is what I'm worried about. What about the bigger ones?
Yeah.
Right? What about the cats who used to be little ones, didn't have the petting zoo, now they're all grown up, and they're stuck on this video thing? We need to reach to them, too, and say, friends, this is remedial education, and we need to take as much of the sting of that remedial part out and say it's not night school, you're not going back to school, high school, anything like that, there's no shame, but let's understand the basics. This is the ABC that they didn't teach you in school. And if you're going to go anywhere with a jazz understanding, it will behoove you to know the alphabet. Like that.
One reason in my jazz history course, and even in my theory class for that matter, I rarely, if ever, show video. Maybe when students are entering the classroom. But other than that, I don't want it filtered through a camera. I want the performance to be filtered through the student's ears. And that's it's an oral art form. To have some editor later saying, use this camera angle, let's push the trombone section now, completely disorients the ear from a personal perspective, and you've got it filtered once again through the person who's done the production work.
Well, we'll say the same thing about a football game. We follow the ball in a football game, and some of the hipper answers from the people who know, the commentators, the coaches, the veterans, or whatever, are going to say, well, it looks completely different if you're in the stands, because you see 22 people on the field moving at once instead of seeing the 3 people around the ball. And so it can be useful because they're picking the ball out for you, right? So there's a value to that commentary, I think, but there's also a value to going to understand the whole game. And I would, if I'm blathering on and on here, but I would introduce one further value to the visual part that I think is of paramount importance, especially for the work that you guys are doing here, which is being able to do what we would call a forensic deduction from visual materials. Like, for instance, we were looking at a video the other day, or just a second ago, from December 23rd, 1979, John Chikai performing live at Soundscape. Strange to say, man, and you made a joke about this houseplant in the corner here. There's a houseplant on the stage at Soundscape. Strange to say, you will use houseplants to do discographical research and to do historical research. I have used the make of cars to figure this out, because you're talking with a musician who says, I remember driving to this gig in this car and it broke down. Okay, let's figure out when you had that car. Well, it was in 1978. So, okay, so the gig wasn't in 1976. You can do this, right? And you can do it from photographic sources and say, look at that, there's a microphone. What's the microphone doing there? Did it go to radio? Did it go to a location recording? Or is it just house amplification? Right?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Look at that. Left-handed bass player. Huh. Not too many of those around. Who is that got to be, right? Those things can be very useful. And that's it's also true for motion picture, but very true, for the farther back you go, the more likely you are to just have still photographs. And there's a real skill that I wish everybody who's in jazz research had and could sharpen to sort of pull every possible thing you can out of what's in that image. We make this joke all the time about the real nerds want to know what color socks Charlie Parker was wearing. You do want to know what color socks, right? And if you're talking with somebody who says, oh, I remember that tie, that's just as good as them saying, I remember that bass.
Yeah.
That tells you it's going to come from a certain place or a certain time.
Yeah. Well said. No, that's wonderful. Forensics, I really like that. All right, so...
Sorry, I'm cutting one more time. I'll give credit to an engineer who taught me a lot, a guy called Kevin Reeves, who still is in the business, who I'm sure he didn't come up with the term, but he conveyed this idea of audio forensics. And this is one of the great obstacle course things that I love to teach to young people at KCR anywhere, is like, okay, play 15 seconds of a live recording of jazz. And let's talk about the music you heard, but let's also talk about what else you heard in the room that can explain to you the audio environment. How many people clapped? How many people coughed? What's the echo like? How far away is the microphone? What's the chatter like? Is the chatter closer than the recording? So much stuff you can figure out, and it's germane to all these things that you guys are dealing with. Is this a field recording from the audience? Is this a close-up recording from amplification? Is it from television? What are the sources of these things? That's a related science called audio forensics, which is picking out all these little details that you can hear.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
So now I want to get to Jazz 101 and Swing University and all of that. So is that a 14-week course? Let me just ask that first.
Jazz 101 is 8 weeks.
8 weeks, pardon.
In Swing University, there are many courses that are 8 weeks. There are some that are 6 and some that are 4 weeks.
So how did you get engaged with all this? I'm so curious.
I give absolute credit. At the beginning of that, the whole program was founded by this guy, Phil Schaap, who was a major mentor for me in radio, in jazz discography, and elsewhere. He still has a radio presence in New York and a major researcher. He's just retired a year and a half ago, I guess, as the curator at Jazz at Lincoln Center. So when he joined up there, he created this program with some of the same premises that we're talking about. People don't know enough about jazz, and he would point to their staff members and certainly the people who go to concerts, and there needs to be a forum where innocent bystanders could come in and say, I want to know, where do I sign up? So Jazz 101 was created for introductory level. Let's start from scratch, the most basic history of jazz, and walk you through where the music started in 8 weeks, where it started to right now, and how will you understand what you're hearing. Second level, Jazz 201 intermediate, same content, or the same path, I should say, of curriculum, but a deeper level of analysis. Let's look, more closely at the way the ensembles are put together and call some more names of people who were responsible for a more nuanced development in jazz. And then Jazz 301, that is serious. That's 3 hours a week for 6 weeks with a test at the end if you want to take it. And that's really, if you feel like you want to become a jazz expert or prove your expertise, this is a whole bunch of information, and if you can catch all of it and imprint it, make an understanding of it, and then spit it back on the test, then the idea was you can get a certificate. I think Schaap and Mr. Marsalis were signing the original ones, maybe something like that for the people who pass the test now, that says this person knows something about jazz music. So those are the sort of the core courses along the way. Courses about, specialized courses about Duke Ellington, about Armstrong. I was invited in to teach first on the topic of Ornette Coleman, 4-week course, then to teach about the history of free jazz, then later to teach about third stream music, about Albert Ayler, about Cecil Taylor, and little by little, all of that stuff. So those programs still are going on there, even with Phil not there. And I've been privileged to sort of take some of that energy and push it around to other places. Just this last fall, or the last few weeks, we've launched this Jazz 101 up at WICN to say, okay, let's see how this will play in a place that's not New York City. And thankfully, there's been a very enthusiastic body of people who came out to say, I do want to know, and I need to start from scratch. Sign me up, Jazz 101.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah.
I hope so.
It seems you had a special interest in the history of what's been called the new black music or avant-garde, free jazz, any of those names. And your writing and research lean kind of heavily toward that area. And I'm wondering, I know that you did things with Albert Ayler and Coleman and Cecil Taylor and Bill Dixon. Why do you feel that music is so important, given the fact that it's challenging and that audiences are not coming in droves for this? And when we had an Avant series here at WPI, off and on through the years, we find that there's a niche audience for sure, but it's certainly not a broad-based audience. And why have you felt like it was necessary to dig so deeply?
Yeah. My answer again probably would be unsatisfying a little bit, and the first one has to be, same answer as before, that you can't, if you're preaching it or paying attention to it, part of the mission has to be to reach to the people who are not already the audience for that music, right? And that means, in a way, it means selling it. I'm not much on capitalism, but like selling the product to people who didn't know they needed it, right? That's exactly what America's doing to us all the time, saying, look, go buy this one, or go buy this one over that one. So if you can exhibit the music at its best and point out this is a valuable thing and convince people through that process, then that's going to bring people to the table who might have been just curious or who might have just turned the corner and heard that sound and said, whoa, what the heck is that? If it pulls them off their course, then that's the first step. But the other part of it that might be unsatisfying is it was never, as with most of us coming into jazz, it's really never a conscious thing, or it very seldom is, of saying, I know this needs to be done, right? For me, it was like those were some sounds that grabbed me as a kid, and truthfully, probably in a false way, first, that grabbed me saying, people were saying, oh, this is revolutionary, and this is radical, and it's extreme, and it's, difficult. And I was like, well, that's kind of me. That was me as a high school kid, so let's see what's going on here. Yeah. And probably liking it for the wrong reasons first, but then following it up to say, okay, and the real punchline to this is I firmly believe, Rich, that the things that make great art, great musical art, are going to be the same values whether the music is from 1816 or 1916 or 2016, and irrespective of style. And you would know from teaching these musical values that craftsmanship, craftspersonship, if you will, and the way that you curate creativity and edit yourself or try to find ways to weave wisdom into the ideas that express as sounds. Those are just the same properties. Precisely the same properties for Earl Hines in 1928 that they are for Cecil Taylor in 1988, right? It's just a matter of to what degree is there a predictable or a rigid framework that they're pouring that creativity into. And in a way, it's a greater miracle that Earl Hines can show you as much creativity as he can, given the stratification or the fixity of the framework that he was working in, and maybe even less of a wonderment that the free jazz is able to accomplish some of the same things. So I think that if we teach people to listen, it's a very Columbia thing to say, but Plato in the Republic says this, there's this in most of the translations, they translate it as, somebody says, all roads lead to the good. And I think there's a lot to that, meaning you can be a plumber, and if you're really a great plumber, you're going to get to nirvana or whatever the perfect point is. If you're a plumber, if you're an air traffic controller, if you're a truck driver, if you're college professor, whatever it is, if you pursue it far enough, you're going to get to that. And I think with musical streams, we would say the same thing. The highest level, you're still looking for the detail and the forward motion and the energy, irrespective of whether the music was written by Beethoven or was improvised on the spot.
Yeah, and having played avant music for a number of years, both in classical environments, but certainly in the jazz world as well, where you are absolutely bare naked. You know, there's nothing there for you to lean on, and whatever's put on the table, you need to explore deeply. And it takes a level of musicianship, of course, to be able to not only carve a path, but also be able to be flexible enough to be diverted by other members of the ensemble who may pull you in one area or another, without having the fixed form or chord progression or what have you. Is all this element of risk. And I found from a player's perspective that musically it opens you enormously, of course, right? Because you're forced to deal with all the musical elements without the safety net of a form or preconceived chord progression. However, from the audience perspective, there's an element of trust that's necessary. They have to trust that you're going to take them somewhere, that this is not just risk-taking for the sake of doing that, but there's going to be some kind of artistic expression that maybe they need to sort out. And a lot of the responsibility, I've found, falls to the individual audience member to make sense of what's happening there on the stage. So there's a little bit of a different rapport with your audience than it would be in a traditional jazz setting, obviously.
You said it well, yeah. I think that's got to be true. Trust and risk are absolutely excellent keywords. Risk on the performance side and trust on the audience side. I dare say there's no doubt that the more things you listen to and the more times you go through this process of engaging the listening, and this is true for anything, right? The more you play soccer, the better you're at soccer. The more you eat fancy food, the more you can discern what causes this flavor and what causes that flavor. And the more you keep diving into the wreck, so to speak, looking at the text, exploring the texts of music, period, or free jazz in specific, the more you're going to understand how cause and effect goes. But you're right, there has to be that trust of getting people in the room or trying to, as you would say, situate a frame around it to say, okay, pay attention to the following. Let us pay attention to these ingredients as they're going on. And to wrap up that whole idea of why this group of people, one of the things that caught me up in the music right away was the availability. Like, for instance, I read a book. I just noticed there's a copy of it over in the Worcester Public Library. I wonder if you guys have it in the school library here, called "As Serious as Your Life." That was written in the late '70s about free jazz to that time by an English woman who's a fantastic documentarian of this whole music, Val Wilmer. I read that book in Tennessee where I was growing up, and it called all these names. And I was like, whoa, I'm going to go to New York. I got to find these guys. And sure enough, 2 years later, I was calling up Milford Graves to say, Mr. Graves, would you like to do a radio interview? And calling up Bill Dixon and able to have access to these people, because that access was going to lead me to get an interior view of what was the causation for them. So to hear the players talk about how they saw it from the inside was going to be the thing that brought me to understand it and hopefully be able to, if it needed translating, translate it or convey it or whatever it was. And it simply wasn't possible. There were a few bebop stars around. Howard McGee had checked out before I got there. Dizzy was gone, pretty quickly and not available to people like me, so on down the line. And now just about everybody is gone. So as with many of the people in the room here, to fill in the gaps on how New Orleans jazz and jazz age jazz and swing era jazz unfolded was, as much as possible, trying to get to oral history on film or documentary films or whatever, and certainly to the written text that documented these people answering questions like we're talking about, to say, here's how it happened. But for me, it was all reading that or getting that from films, except for the people who had been the designers of that music in the 60s. They were still around. Many of them still are around. And for me, that's still a thing. It's still going to the source to try to call somebody up and say, is that you on trumpet? Or, or to try and reason it out, what went on there. And it still is possible for a certain segment of the recent history of jazz to do that, to have that access.
So let's this is a great time to segue into what was going on in New York with Soundscape, Verna Gillis, and then eventually Roswell Rudd, we'd like to talk about as well. So let's start with Soundscape. What can you tell us about it?
Soundscape was it's the concept. It's a bunch of different things. in the biggest terminology, it's the conceptual, no, it's the brand identity that's been adopted by this woman, Verna Gillis, who's a major producer in the music. She, way back in the beginning, was a radio producer. I think from 74 forward, she was on WBAI and created a radio program called Soundscape. She took that name from a book by a man whose full name I can't call, but I think Murray was in there somewhere, but the book is called The Tuning of the World, and he's referring to the notion of soundscapes, which actually has become an item, a concept of great currency in ethnomusicology and modern musicology and so on. But like a landscape of sound, so shall it be. So her radio show was Soundscape on WBAI. She was married for 10 years at that point already to a sculptor named Bradford Graves, who was very intensely into many musics, especially world music and folk culture of the world and avant-garde music and jazz along the way. So at a certain point, they had access to a space on West 52nd Street in 1978 that they opened sort of as a behind-the-scenes rehearsal space. It was, believe it or not at street level, but up in the upper floors of this building on the west side of Manhattan. And they decided to open it as a club on a fledgling basis in a few shows in 78, and then for real in the end of 79, and then constantly, if not nightly, then at least many nights a week for many seasons of the year, performances in 1981, 2, 3, and all the way up to 1986, though it's discontinuous after 1983, of using this place as an independent performance spot, meaning it isn't exactly what we would call a nightclub, and it's certainly not everything that happened there was what we would call jazz. It was all about creative music with a little bit of mainstream jazz, but mostly avant-garde jazz and experimental music, what we would call free improvised music that wasn't even calling itself jazz, and a great hotbed for Latin music, for Latin jazz, straight from Cuba in 1980 forward especially. So that was the spot Soundscape, and I think there were no further performances there after about 1986, but there's copious documentation. As you guys know, some video, a lot of audio, a lot of textual matters that sort of tell us what went on at Soundscape, and a whole bunch of the primaries, many musicians, some of whom have already told their stories about it. Verna Gillis, who's the idea person, her husband is now deceased for 20 years, but some of the other people who worked or were on the scene there have survived to tell their story. So there are still ways to fit together some of the pieces of what the scene was like at Soundscape. But it has a relationship to the club world of jazz presentation in New York at that period. It also has a relationship to what we would call the loft world, which is independent, homemade, sort of DIY presentations of jazz. And it also was right in the seam of when it was maybe you guys know something about this, in the top of the Reagan years, a lot of funding dripped away from arts presentation in general, and crafty people who were into presenting needed to find new ways to get government support for what they were doing. And therefore, Soundscape was one of the places that benefited from just the very front end of getting New York City or New York State funds or other funds to sort of help propel the programming that went on there.
Was it a 501c3, or was it just getting grants for presenting? How did that work?
That's a great question. I should know the answer to that, Rich, and I do not. It has become a 501c3. I don't know if that happened during the time of the club. And I say that because Soundscape is still an active brand identity that Verna has used for other concerts. She went on to produce a bunch of other important stuff, some of which was worldwide and some very popular in many dimensions. And then she became partnered with Roswell Rudd, the trombone player, starting about 20 years ago, at sort of a transitional point for both of them, and has managed his career and produced almost all of his recorded output since then under the name, presented by Soundscape or produced by Soundscape. So it still is sort of it's the umbrella for her musical designs.
Yeah, wonderful, great.
Yeah.
And let's move to Roswell for a moment. And I know that you have a relationship with him and with Verna.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm curious to know how that came about, first of all, and then where you see Roswell fitting into this whole thing.
Oh, Roz is just like what we were talking about. He was one of the people who I had heard about. I'm sure bought one of his 1966 record, his first record as a leader. When I was a kid, I was shaking in my boots because it was really scary to spend like $6.99 on a record. Yeah. What? Who has $6.99? And it was a used copy of it, and you know those were some powerful sounds. At least to start to know who Roswell Rudd was, and then through my learning years, you know, trying to follow his path, and eventually learning, well, this guy's still around. He still is in upstate New York. He was a bit off the scene at that period in the top of the 1990s. And those were kind of the hardest times for him to be to grab hold of Roswell Rudd as a presence on the music scene, because he was either playing in Europe or he was playing in backwoods places upstate, but not playing, generally speaking, in the major presentation points in the city. I went to see him for the first time, I'm sure, 20 years ago this last summer at a place called the Rosendale Cafe up on Route 32, I think, just west of the New York State Thruway. Because I heard Roswell Rudd was going to be there, and he wasn't playing in New York, so why not make the 60-mile trip out of town to hear this guy play? Met up with him, was in touch back and forth, and quickly went to some archival questions for him, saying, hey, I heard about this piece. I had somehow I had heard about this thing that he referred to called the Blues for Planet Earth. That was a concert from the spring of 1968. Mm-hmm. And he said, funny you should ask. I've got a poster for it right here on my wall, just like you guys have posters of shows on your wall. That's the history, right? Yeah. And then he said, here, man, you're into tapes, and mailed me the tape recording of the Blues for Planet Earth and said, see what you can make of this. And I, back and forth, and I said, wait a minute, man, it sounds like the band is out of tune with the organ. And I was, do I tune it up to the organ or do I tune it up to the band? And he was like, well, take your pick. I think the organ was probably out of tune. But anyway, stuff like that. Yeah. More and more and more questions. Roswell has a deep, deep involvement with almost every stage of the music, and he's a great figure to reach all the way back into. How do you say it? If you're stretching your arm all the way out, me as a kid stretching my arm all the way out into the past to touch hands with this guy who was born, 37 years or 36 years before I was, and to know that he as a kid was stretching his arm all the way out, and who was he touching? James P. Johnson. I just found the date for this. James P. Johnson played a concert at Hamilton College that he attended, and I think it's May 8th of 47. We got to check on that in the James P. Johnson discography, but Roz would have said it was 46 and said, okay, that was his formative experience. Here's Pops Foster playing bass from New Orleans, who was already by that point nearly 60 years old, right? Here's James P. Johnson, who was 50 years old and only had a couple more years to go. So Roz got the last sparks of that. He lived through that as a player of early jazz in the 50s and 60s, and that revival of it, and also lived through the history of bebop as from an outsider position and the insider position of knowing hard bop through the eyes of Herbie Nichols, the composer, who he had a close kinship with, and falling right into, as some of his contemporaries did, falling right into the front end of the avant-garde, 1960-61, and he was sort of playing all of those bases. He was playing every position on the field of jazz in that period. So there is no time that you or I or any of you, should you be so lucky, would sit down with Roswell Rudd and not learn something. If you can listen and if you can draw it out from him and write it down, right, about some little smidgen of detail, and he's forgotten a lot, I'm sure, just like we all have, and he remembers a lot. He's forgotten more than we ever knew about that stuff, and had an extraordinary insight to then go to the piano and say, well, no, he taught me to do this, and raise the fifth on it, or whatever it is, to get to the direct musical understanding of this is how that can be heard right now. Yeah. So bravo to Roz, and thank goodness for Verna, who's done great things to let the last 15 years worth of fans know more and more and more worldwide about his music as applied to all sorts of world music, sometimes looking back, sometimes looking into the other musical scenes that are going on right now.
When he was traveling in Europe, would he do pickup ensembles there with musicians that either he knew or had?
No, it depends. It depends on which period you're talking about. I mean, in 1980, let's say from the mid-70s into the mid-80s, it's something like that. Not quite pickup exactly, but an invitation from somebody who says, you know, Roswell, I know your work. You remember we met at so-and-so. If I put this band together, this quartet, or you know, will you come and play with my group? Sure. So yeah, it's some sort of a situation like that. Yeah. And that carried on up until the brink of the 21st century, I guess. And then since then, it's been mostly playing with people who he, as far as European players or performances in Europe, taking bands there that he knows well or is acquainted with, like even the reunion of the New York Art Quartet or the reunion of the Archie Shepp groups from the 60s. I mean, those have had a lot of life in the last 15, 20 years, something like that.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it is.
Well, the last thing I wanted to talk with you about briefly would be your 3-point, because this is
Triple Point Records.
Yeah, I mean, this is it's another way of doing preservation work and bringing perspective, framing, archiving. So, tell me what's going on with that.
Well, I mean, I sort of spent enough time in the record business and as a collector, I guess, to have the sort of, let's call it an understanding, but it might also be kind of a fetish for saying, you know, I like physical recordings of things. And you know, the fundamental part of that is I like to know that some of the music we're talking about has a likelihood of being playable even after we're all gone. And no offense to digital media, but we know for a fact that you can still drop the needle on a record from 1917 and play it not only as good as but better than you could in 1917 right now. So I'm ready to put my colleagues and I who started the label, we said, let's put our chips on this one. If we carve this into a record of 500 copies or something like that, then at least there's going to be 500 ways that this important music can be heard after we've all, you know, passed on, irrespective of what, you know, cataclysms overtake the earth. And that's true. It's a big proposition. I mean, a lot of people, you guys probably yourselves have turntables now. A lot more people now are getting into playing records, and this is the main mission of that company: is putting out vinyl releases in highest fidelity of important records that either were destined for release at the time and never came out for some reason, or in some cases, like with the New York Art Quartet, with that band that Roswell was in, reaching back into now 50 years, or more than 50 years ago, to find some things that were some of the few further documents that can tell us what was this band up to, and then trying to reason it out. I mean, I honestly, Rich, I think it's exactly the same. It's organic with every other principle we've been talking about. How do you put the sounds in people's ears right next to the explanation about what went down?
Yeah.
And this is a way of, the book says what happened, it shows you the pictures, and the record plays the music for you.
Yeah, and you've got nice graphics and a booklet with each of these recordings. As I understand it, you pressed as little as 500 on some of these, and they're all hand numbered, and so they're really collectibles.
Well, and it's, you know, even some of my friends and people who I, you know, dearly love and believe in the music would give me a little heat for that and say, you know, how is it you can claim to be reaching to the people if these things cost as much as they do because they're fancy editions? And I hear that, but the way we started was to say, well, listen, I'm looking at Cecil Taylor records from 1957 that are trading hands for $90, and Cecil gets none of that. Yeah. So let's put out a Cecil Taylor record that starts at $90 so we can pay the money to him while he's alive and able to enjoy it, and made the very first payment to him to say, okay, now that's taken care of, and now these can be collector's items, and we'll all, you know, pay accordingly, but he's going to benefit in a way that's commensurate to that.
Yeah, good for you.
So that's the principle behind it. It hasn't yet dominated the world, and you know, people who are using more efficient financial models, I'm sure, are selling more records than we're selling, but we continue to do what we want to do.
Wonderful.
What we need to do.
What we need to do. Congratulations, Ben. It's been a pleasure having you. Thank you.
It's a pleasure being with you guys. And congratulations, I should say, congratulations to you on doing the database and the projects to gather the information and to spread it. This is the important work that we're doing. I'm glad to be on the same team that you're on.
Thank you, man. Pleasure.
Amen.